right, hello and welcome to the OnStage Colorado Podcast. I'm Alex Millett here once again with arts reporter Toni Tresca. Hey, Toni.
Hey, Alex. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, we're recording this early on Monday morning, October 21st, so keep that in mind as we talk about things coming up. So in this episode, as usual, we'll unpack the shows we've seen, talk about whether we think they're good, bad, or not to go check out. And our main topic this week is an appropriate one for spooky season. We're going to just talk about scary things. And, with so much Halloween stuff on stage and in other places all around Colorado, we're taking a deep dive into what's out there and also look into a little bit about sort of the history of scaring people, what scares people, what used to scare people in the olden days, and how much has changed or not. So let's stick around for that in just a little bit. And then later in the podcast, I have an interview with Blaine Krauss. So he is the lead in Hamilton, which is the touring Broadway show up now at the Denver Center all the way through November 24th. So that will be coming up a little later in the podcast. So it's a really nice interview. He's a very nice young man. And so after understudying both Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr for quite a while, Blaine stepped into the big man's shoes for this North American tour of Hamilton. This is one of two casts concurrently running in North America from he calls the Hamilton universe, because there's also the cast in New York. And also I think there's an international touring cast or two. So it's a great conversation with an actor who's really at the top of his career. We talked about his path. He started out as kind of a singer to a stage actor and then musical. He toured the world as Simba in The Lion King. He was in the Broadway production of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, and how he landed this gig. And also, we got into some thoughts on the character himself, and he had some interesting thoughts about how he sees Burr and Hamilton as almost like the same character, two sides of the same coin, like almost like Mozart and Salieri or something like that. So stick around for that. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing Blaine's perspective. Hamilton's a great show. I know you just saw it recently. We're about to talk about that in our weekly roundup of what we've seen around the state. So I guess we can just use that as our transition.
Yeah. So this is, I guess, maybe the third time I've seen Hamilton, and as good as ever. I guess I've seen three different casts, including the one that was, and then there was the one on TV where it was Lin-Manuel Miranda. And then, so, I mean, it's hard to argue with Hamilton. It's just a great show. What was really cool was the audience was so diverse. There were just so many different kinds of people there, young, old, white, black, brown, whatever, all kinds of people really digging the really sort of different kind of musical. And as I was talking about with Blaine, it's actually coming up on its 10th anniversary. So that's hard to believe.
I know it's really hard. Ever since Lin-Manuel Miranda's hip-hop musical hit Broadway in 2015?
Just January, I think. When it first...
It's really just completely transformed the entire musical theater industry and how things are composed. I mean, we wouldn't have Six or all of these other kind of musicals like that if Hamilton hadn't first come in and kind of carved the new path for using alternative contemporary sounds on stage.
And also different kinds of casting, like not really worrying. I mean, it's not that didn't exist before, but I think Hamilton really kind of broke it out where it's like, whoever is the best for the role gets the part, whatever they look like. So that was very cool. So plenty of opportunity to see Hamilton. There's also a $10 ticket lottery that pops up every, I think, Friday. So if you go on the denvercenter.org website, you can see the details about that. And that is a really good price for a ticket for Hamilton or any show for that matter.
Yeah. And this week, we both saw Wonderbound's production of Devil's Crush. This is the contemporary dance group based out of Denver. It's kicking off their new season. And this ballet follows the devil, who has kind of come down to earth. He falls in love with a woman, but maybe this woman doesn't want to play by his rules.
Right. As usual, it's a really strong production, fantastic choreography, amazing dancers, great sets, great sound. As you pointed out after the show, the lighting is really spectacular in this show. Really, really, I don't know. How would you describe it, Toni?
I would describe it as just, this is kind of their first full season in their new custom-built space that they're in over in Nodo. that part of Denver, which is the most disgusting name. It's in North Denver.
No doubt. Yeah. Okay.
And I think that they've just really kind of found their own. They are really incorporating a lot of interesting usage of side lighting. They had different side light panels set up in 2 of the wings entrance. They also have some really cool front lighting that they were playing with that would light up and change colors, in addition to their regular lighting rig out front and some really interesting backlighting that they had installed for this. There were a couple of moments in which it was entirely lit by backlighting and side lighting. And with a show like this that's kind of about the intersection between heaven, earth, purgatory, and hell, I think all of those lighting effects really added to the cerebralness of the performance.
Yeah. It was a visually just a very arresting show. In addition to all the great choreography, the dancing, the athleticism, the way that those particular dancers move using, they kind of do almost like a I don't know. There's a martial art where you use the other person's momentum against you, and here they use it kind of in tandem, where they use gravity in a really interesting way. That I'm not a dance connoisseur by any means, but it seems like it's a different kind of approach than other ballet that I've seen. So the only comment I has, and we've talked about this, was that Wonderbound has been doing a lot with moving set pieces, and it's really cool the way they do it. That dancers are the ones moving these pieces around, and they had a really neat kind of curvy, several pieces of curved set that kind of would move into like almost spirals, and they had seats on one side.
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe it got a little carried away with how much it was actually moving, but overall it's a really cool effect.
I thought that was a fair criticism. The only other note that I had as well is in kind of typical Garrett Amon, he's the artistic director, fashion, and he also devises the stories for these. The first act I thought was really strong story-wise, and then the second act until the final scene, it's a little bit abstract and heady. He's kind of experimenting with more different dance types in the second act, which doesn't allow him to kind of maybe dive as deep into the story that he set up with that first act.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we'll have a review of that from our dance critic, Alice, here pretty soon. And then another show that we were both at, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, was Frankenstein, which is an interactive/immersive production by Audacious Theater, which is playing at several breweries. This was the second weekend. It was at Fiction Brewery in Denver. And you and I were both there. And I have to say, this one, it went on for a bit longer than their usual shows. It said it was going to be an hour. It was more like an hour and a half. I felt like it really kind of dragged in places just because they were doing more of the original story and really getting into a lot of the kind of the monster himself was quite literary and articulate and poetic, and a lot of his soliloquies and things like that. And it was interesting, but I definitely found myself sagging a little bit in parts of it.
Yeah, I would agree. The writer, Alyssa Bosk, she used Mary Shelley's original text, and I think at times that's really fascinating, particularly as you mentioned with the monster, his soliloquies and kind of his introspection. However, since it's also supposed to be kind of a fast-paced comedy set in a brewery with a bunch of drunk people, it kind of it's a little bit slow at times, which is a little bit interesting. I've never said that about an Audacious Immersive production before. They're kind of known for the really fast-paced, in-your-face stuff. This was a little bit slower for them and a little bit more introspective, it was an interesting choice. I'm not sure if I would have definitely trimmed a little bit too, particularly if I think from a couple of the early scenes where they include the element from Antarctica that is featured from Mary Shelley's original novel.
Which might just baffle a lot of people.
Totally. You leaned over to me like about 10 minutes into the show, and you were like, "What story is this?" And I'm like, "Alex, this is Frankenstein."
Yeah, I have to say I've never actually read the book, so I would also say, people aren't necessarily drunk, but they are drinking beer, and that kind of can make you a little sleepy. And so I think if you're going to be doing that kind of a setting, you need to keep that in mind and really keep it moving and keep it light and fun. So. But I think it was a little bit of a maybe an experiment or reach for Audacious to do a little bit more like that. So props to them for trying something new.
Definitely was. I from talking with the creative team over there, this is part of their kind of eventual plan to tackle the Halloween universe. They're going to have a whole bunch of these kind of trunk shows that they're creating around different popular spooky season characters that then they hope to be able to do in rep once they build this up. So this is their first attempt at that, kind of in the style of Drunk Christmas and Space Conflicts, which they've done before. Yeah, I think it could use a little bit more polishing, but I like the idea.
Yep. So another show that you went to, I just posted Eric Fitzgerald review of this on our site, $1 Million Quartet. So this is at Lone Tree Arts Center. Was this a touring production? It didn't seem like it was a local cast, or was it?
It's not a touring production, but it's Lone Tree Arts Center, and they hired a lot of union folks who are from out of town. So Lone Tree Arts Center is one of the few union theaters in Colorado, and so they are required to hire a certain amount of union talent. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to hire out-of-state union talent, but that is what they have chosen to do largely. And I would say it works more or less. The production is really strong there. Not, like you said, not super local, but I can't argue with the final product. It's telling the story of these four figures: Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis Presley at their kind of the one day that they all were together at Sun Records. And I had never seen this before. I kind of grew up on this music. I play the drums, and so my music teacher had actually played Johnny Cash in a production of $1 Million Quartet. So he would play a lot of this music when I was younger, and this is what I learned music on. So it was really cool to kind of hear it actualized. And god damn, the performers that they've hired are so spot on, particularly Johnny Cash and Jerry Lee Lewis, to the actual figures themselves, and do some really impressive showmanship. Like the Jerry Lee Lewis, he blindfolds himself, he's playing the piano while he's at one point he turns around backwards on top of the piano and is playing it behind him. One of the guitar players puts the guitar behind his head and is riffing for a good while. So it's just a really impressive display of musicianship. The story is fairly predictable. There's nothing that's going to shock you there if you've ever seen any type of musical bio thing before. But if you're looking for an absolute banger of a production that does justice to these musical figures in a really slick staging, Lone Tree Arts Center's got you covered.
All right. So that show runs through the 27th. So this coming Sunday. It's a show that's been done around Colorado before. Some people, people have seen it, but it sounds like this is a really strong production of it. A show that I saw in Boulder was the Ballet of Paula Aguilar. So we've talked about this several times. This is Boulder Ensemble Theater Company, a world premiere play, Bernard Kubria. And so Jerry Henshaw directed this, and so it's a pretty funny play, great set, really inventive set by Brian Watson with projections. And so this is about chasing the Latino vote. And so the whole concept is these kind of not idiot, but just kind of really cynical group of political consultants for the quote unquote the party, i.e. the Democrats, bring in this Latina woman, Paula Aguilar, who's played by Laura Chavez. So really a strong show. I was a little surprised it didn't have a little more meat to it. It really, so there's actually some of the comic bits verge into camp. There's like at one point, there's a character wearing a clown nose and like giant syringes because she's also going through this IVF procedure. There's a lot of talk about sperm and sperm selection. There's a lot of breaking of the fourth wall where she's asking the audience what they think about things. And so I don't know, it's a little bit mismatched in places in terms of the type of comedy that they were doing, but great cast, great set, and strong direction by Jerry Henshaw.
Sounds pretty interesting. And
what else? You had one more that you saw this weekend, right?
I did. My final show was one that I talked about for my headliners a couple weeks ago. It's by the Golden History Tours and Elevate Immersive. It's the Talking Dead Haunted Pub Crawl. So this is in Golden, and you are going around. It starts at the Golden Mill, and it's these ghost stories from the town of Golden. And it's everything from, we heard from a miner who he and his crew drowned in the underground mine under Boulder, under the main kind of river there. And
Ooh.
spookily enough, that mine was never able to be evacuated, so their bodies are just floating in the river underground, trapped forever, which was terrifyingly spooky.
It is.
And then to other things, like apparently I had no idea, but Golden was like a hot belly for the KKK, and like on Castle Rock up there, they used to have like 10,000 people who would come out to do their ritualistic cross burnings there. And so they had this woman who was portraying the first female preacher for the KKK, who was there and sharing her story. And it was stuff like that as you're kind of walking all around Golden. They've got a combination of actors who are dressed up as these kind of ghostly figures, as well as a tour guide who is taking you around Golden. You make 3 stops at these different pubs around there. I went with a big group of my friends, and we had a really fun time. It's a really cool way to learn a little bit about Colorado, the real life spooky stuff that's gone on here, and also have a few drinks with your friends around Golden, which is a beautiful place to be.
Yeah, it was a beautiful weekend too, for the most part.
It was an incredible weekend. We could not have asked for better weather. It was about 50 degrees when we were walking around, which is perfect for a ghost tour because it's enough so you can have a little. You can feel the wind and you get a little freaked out every now and then, but not cold enough that you want to go inside.
Yeah, warm weather is no good for ghost stories for some reason. You really need a little bit of cold. So speaking of ghost stories, I took a drive up to Evergreen yesterday on Sunday for the matinee of Spirit Level from Evergreen Players. So this is at the historic Center Stage Theater there in Evergreen. And so this is a pretty light comedy. It's very silly. It's like we spoke last time, it's got a little bit of a Beetlejuice thing to it where this couple that drowns go back to their home and try and dissuade people from coming in to live there. But as it turns out, there's a couple that comes in that they actually turn out kind of liking. So the guy's an aspiring novelist. The guy who died was a successful novelist. So somehow or another. So there's all kinds of silly things where like a fairy godmother comes in and gives the spirit wife the power to sort of by putting her hand on the live characters' heads, make them do things, and so and so there was, like I said, it was pretty silly and but fun show, and also had this interesting aspect of the fact that the reason they were in limbo is because they couldn't get into heaven because the husband was an atheist, and he, even though he got to the pearly gates and was talking to Saint Peter, he just couldn't bring himself to say to admit whatever. And of course, at some point he has a epiphany where he needs to do that in order to help out another character and blah blah blah. So fun show, and that one is running through November 10th up at Center Stage in Evergreen. So that is what we've seen this weekend. Lots of stuff. Anything in the old mailbag, Tony?
That while we don't have any new ratings, reviews, or emails, we did get some in-person love for the podcast from actor Elton Tanega when I was over at Town Hall Art Center interviewing the creative team of Cannibal the Musical for a Westward article that's coming out this week. Elton shared that he loves the podcast and always looks forward to listening each week. So if you're listening right now, Elton, thanks so much for the love and thanks for listening.
Yeah, and right back at you, Elton. We always love seeing you on stage. You're always a great addition to a cast. What role is he playing in Cannibal?
So he is playing James Humphrey, who is kind of the most dim-witted of all of the characters. He's constantly just he's getting into shenanigans and getting the rest of his crew into trouble because of his antics. He's doing a really fun job. I sat in on a rehearsal for this, and honestly, that whole musical just looks like it's going to be a whole heck of a lot of fun. I know both you and I are going to be there this Saturday, so looking forward to it. I know. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Well, moving on to our main topic this week is scary shit. So it's probably fair to say that ever since Gorg and Blarg sat around the campfire, hoping not to get eaten by wolves, people have been doing their best to scare the shit out of each other. So I don't know what's behind that. Do you think, Tony? But first, let me cue up a little spooky music for this section.
I mean, I think there's just something really important about being able to safely explore what actually scares you.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is going to be scared, but what scares you is going to be different, of course. But horror really allows you to kind of experience that in a controlled environment and build up, in theory, resilience and kind of coping methods for how to deal with that stress. I think it's also just kind of fun to get that adrenaline rush when you're in a theater with a lot of other people. Jump scares aren't my personal favorite, but there's something really effective about them when you're seeing them, particularly in a group and kind of getting to do that. There's that social bonding and getting to share that experience together that is like, okay, you know what? We can make it through this. It was scary. That was a loud noise. That clown has a freaking chainsaw, but we're going to be okay.
Yeah. And you can see some of the evolutionary benefits, I guess, being attuned to threats, in the real world. And, and scary stories often, they have lessons about cultural values and morality and things like that. So, while we don't have any record of what our Neanderthal cousins were using to freak each other out long ago, there are records of scary stuff going all the way back to the Roman era. So I was looking up Pliny the Younger, also great beer from California. He had some ghost stories. So he was a Roman author, and he wrote about ghostly encounters. Most famously described a haunted house in Athens, where a philosopher rents a large house only to be visited by a rattling specter of an old man in chains. That sounds familiar. Leading to the discovery and proper burial of human remains, and lays the ghost to rest. So that's a common thing we hear.
Oh yeah, I have to imagine, particularly back then, when there were so many superstitions around how to prepare the dead, that proper disposal of a dead body was going to be a recurring theme, and it keeps showing up, not only in the Roman era, but all the way through to kind of contemporary time. And it makes sense. You probably don't want to just leave dead things laying around wherever. It's probably good to dispose of it properly.
Very good, yeah. So another one that I came across was Petronius was another Roman writer who wrote the Satyricon. So this is a really old novel, and among the other things in it, there's one of the earliest ever werewolf tales in literature. So a soldier transforms into a wolf by performing a ritual at a graveyard, and then runs off to attack a flock of sheep. So this kind of kicked off a lot of werewolf tropes, the whole voluntary transformation or involuntary, the blending of human intelligence with animal behavior. And it really influenced centuries of folklore and horror literature that's, to this day, Disney's Descendants being maybe the most recent werewolf stuff.
Yeah, and we're about to have a new Wolfman come out next year from Lee Winnell, who he just recently did an adaptation of The Invisible Man a couple years ago. So about to have a new Wolfman maybe enter the cultural zeitgeist.
Okay. So what about getting a little closer in like the medieval times?
Yeah, so in medieval Europe, the one that you may be familiar with, dear listeners, is the novel Beowulf and the monster Grendel. That's a kind of a pretty famous iteration and updating of the monster trope for the medieval European times.
Yeah. I think it was in maybe early high school. I remember being truly fascinated by this story when I first read it. And so I think it taps into the idea of being killed and eaten. Seems particularly frightening. You think about Jaws, and how that really resonated with people. So I loved Beowulf. And there was also a great novel that came out later called Grendel, which was written from the monster's point of view.
I've actually never read Beowulf. I don't really know anything about it other than the byline, like the short, high level overview. Is it worth a read? Do you think it holds up?
Not if you listen to Woody Allen. There's a famous funny scene in one of his movies where she's talking about, I think one of the characters is saying they want to do some continuing education. And he just said, well, don't take anything where they make you read Beowulf. But it's a very old language. I think it was probably originally written in poem form. I think it's worth checking out if you never have. So just a random aside on the theater connection, Beowulf is a famous scenic designer whose work can be seen on stage now at the Denver Center in Avaz. So Beowulf is a pretty cool name to have.
Yeah, That is very cool. He's not a monster though, right? Just a scenic designer.
I don't know what he does in his off time, but yeah, he does great set work.
Fair enough, Alex. Fair enough. So now on to my favorite of all the monsters is the vampires and the Revenants. So vampires, as you may be familiar, are these blood-sucking spirits that appear in myths around the world. Everything from Mesopotamia to Greece to Italy. The vampires have kind of been a forever cultural fascination, and the modern vampire lore is heavily influenced by Eastern European folklore specifically. A lot of this, I think, around vampires comes from these medieval fears and this misunderstanding that they had. So since there was a lack of scientific knowledge about death, and disease was going to fuel speculation. So the plagues that would come from, as we now know, probably rats or bats or other animals there, got attributed to these vampires. And that kind of misunderstanding about how the decomposition process just kind of only added to the vampire myths, particularly if someone gets bit by a rat or something and they leave any marks in there. It's only going to add to the vampire myths spreading around the world. So
sure.
18th and 19th century literature kind of synthesized various folkloric elements around it, and then obviously works like Dracula codified the modern vampire archetype, kind of blending ancient fears with Gothic romance. All the way up until today, we're still clearly fascinated by vampires, everything from obviously the kind of more sparkly Twilight vampires and the heartthrobs to Kate Hamill's kind of comic take on the vampire myth that's currently playing at the Arvada Center in Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy, really.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned a Revenant. What's that other than something played by Leonardo DiCaprio to win an Oscar?
So a Revenant is an undead creature from folklore believed to return from the grave to haunt or terrorize the living. So their agenda is kind of usually focused on seeking vengeance or kind of having some unfinished business in the regular world, and they showed up a lot in medieval European tales. They're kind of considered to be the modern precursor to both vampires as well as the zombie.
Okay, so they're kind of like the missing link that connects vampires and zombies. Evolutionary.
Yeah, all the monster myths, they definitely kind of build on each other.
Yeah.
I have to imagine after you hear one monster story, maybe from another tribe or another part of, from people from another part of the world, you're like, oh, that is pretty spooky. Maybe that makes more sense than what we were thinking. Mm-hmm. And so they just kind of build on each other.
Right. So what about even a little more modern, like the 18th and 19th century? A lot of stuff coming out of Europe, especially.
Yeah, so while some people may push back against this as kind of being attributed to horror, I think that the Brothers Grimm from the 19th century really did a lot to kind of push forward a lot of the modern tropes. I mean, those brothers were sick fuckers. From Hansel, Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Rumpelstiltskin, those novels are a whole heck of a lot darker in their original versions. Most of them are not making it out alive. And there's one lesser-known story that they wrote about a father who cuts off a girl's hand to save himself from the devil.
My God. See, this is what happens when you don't understand science.
Very true. And there's another one they've written called The Juniper Tree, in which a stepmother, I mean, it's always the stepmother, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's that fascination? Come on.
I don't know. What about the kindly stepmother? There's plenty of those, mostly.
Exactly. But in this Juniper Tree, this stepmother decapitates her stepson and serves him as a stew to his father.
My God. Yeah.
Big yikes.
Wow. I mean, it seems like burying the evidence would have been easier, but, it's not as ghoulish and interesting to read, I guess. So, what about...
No, not quite as literary.
Yeah. And then we get into the era of Gothic literature. What are some of those examples?
So a big kind of example that really kicks this off is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Not only does her tale kind of contribute to this idea of bringing flesh back from the dead, combining it, but it kind of combines the scientific with some of the spiritual in a really interesting way. It's called, one of the subscripts for it is Prometheus Tales. And so it's kind of riffing on this ancient story, but putting it in a new context. Mary Shelley that's why she's attributed not only a horror writer, but she's basically the inventor of contemporary science fiction as we know it today.
Yeah.
She's really combining those different elements into one story. We've talked about this. Frankenstein continues to be very popular, and they just did it with Audacious Immersive is doing it right now. They're putting their own kind of comedic spin on this tale.
Right. And then, of course, Dracula, which we just mentioned.
Of course.
You know, Edgar Allan Poe's short stories over across the pond here in America, you know, like The Fall of the House of Usher, which Debut Theater just did a reading of it. Mask of the Red Death. Now, these are, I don't know, did you read these in schools? These are truly scary stories. They really are unbelievably creepy.
I didn't read House of Usher or Red Death, but I did read Poe's The Telltale Heart, which is also, that is another freaky one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Poe certainly did a lot. He's kind of that combination of, yes, horror, but also more Gothic. And Gothic was a pretty popular style in the 18th and 19th century. It's more focused on the human. It's more psychological. It's more focused on what happens, particularly like when the human element goes astray rather than more of the monstrous, human as monster.
Yeah, they're not as supernatural. There's not as much of that. It's more like just people doing bad things and suffering the psychological consequences for it. So just quick note about Bram Stoker. I just read in October 19th New York Times story that a new story from Bram Stoker was recently uncovered and will be read at the annual Bram Stoker Festival in Dublin in this coming weekend, October 25th through 28th. So if you want to jump over to Dublin, you can hear that. The story is called Gibbet Hill. So it takes place in Surrey, England, at a spot where that became infamous when 3 men who'd killed a sailor were hanged there in the 18th century. So a gibbet is a gallows. In it, a young man goes for a stroll and comes upon a trio of eerie children, a boy with hair of spun gold, and a wriggling mass of earthworms concealed in his clothes, along with 2 pretty dark-haired Indian girls. So make what you will of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's always so cool when like there's those older stories that are kind of dug up. I wonder how they found it. Did they mention that in the article at all?
They did. I think
uncovered?
It was just some doctor. I think he was into Bram Stoker and he was poking through. I think he saw a reference to the story in a newspaper clipping and then was like, oh man, how do I find this? And eventually dug it up somehow. So, but yeah, I'll put the link in the show notes so you can read the story if you want.
And that's why journalism is important.
That's
folks.
right.
Without it, we don't uncover Bram Stoker's lost story. So, moving kind of on to Native American folklore, they also have a ton of contributions to horror. They've got their own monsters and things that frighten them that were pretty different. So, the Wendigo legends, these are the Algonquin-speaking peoples. So, of North America, they describe a malevolent spirit or creature associated with cannibalism, insatiable hunger, and winter starvation. These beings are often portrayed as towering humanoids with animal-like features said to possess humans and drive them to active cannibalism, or to be the transformed results of humans who engaged in cannibalism during extreme hardships. Maybe old Alfred Packer is one of these.
Yeah, he was a skinwalker. Yeah, cannibalism is a great taboo among humans, so it's not surprising that it definitely pops up in a lot of horror, and also in survival stories, where you may not have a choice, like Alfred.
Totally. Another one of these horror stories from the early tribes come from the Navajo people. They are kind of the original inventors of the iconic skinwalkers. So these are the tale of the evil witches or shamans who can transform into animals or other people by using dark magic. So these are shapeshifters who are believed to use their powers for evil, such as cursing others, causing sickness, death, and they are deeply feared in the Navajo cultures as embodiments of pure evil that can only be spoken of with great caution.
Ooh, yeah, skinwalkers. They sound just terrifying. What about there's another one that I've heard of called the Thunderbird myth. What are those all about?
Yeah, so these are pretty common amongst various tribes, and these are described as enormous, powerful birds that are capable of creating thunder and lightning with the beating of their wings and flashing of their eyes. So these massive legendary creatures are often portrayed as protective spirits or divine beings. So they're not quite as monstrous as their depiction might make them sound. They're actually really associated with strength, power, and weather control, and they're frequently depicted in tribal arts and storytelling as both revered and feared entities of the natural world, which I think is kind of interesting here because this is kind of one of our early examples of the kind of intersection between horror and the climate and the weather.
Right.
So many of these monsters and the associations there kind of come from those fears. And you can imagine, particularly when you're nomadic people kind of living outside, these beings that can control the weather have a great deal of importance and power to you and your communities.
Yeah, they control the weather. They must have been Democrats, those Thunderbirds.
Alex, stop. Oh my God.
So, well, it seems like the time is ripe to tap into some more of those Native American stories. There are some Skinwalker movies. There's a really cool Toni Hillerman book I remember reading long ago it's called Skinwalkers. But yeah, there's maybe some Thunderbirds or something. There was an anime or a cartoon called Thunderbirds. I don't know if it had anything to do with the Native American.
I think you're right, but I'm not sure how associated they are.
Yeah, it was just a cool word. So, all right, well, let's turn to film. You are the king of horror film, or not the king, but you have a podcast that you're associated with where you talk about horror films. So let's talk about this area of expertise.
Yeah, I really do enjoy horror films. I co-host the Such a Nightmare podcast with Dr. Catherine Troyer, in which that's what we talk about on there. Starting early, probably one of the most early and kind of iconic monster cinema films is Nosferatu from 1922. This is kind of a largely silent black and white adaptation of the tale. It's utterly horrifying. Some of the visuals that they create in that are even more powerful than I think any of the other subsequent adaptations of the vampire. It's kind of where a lot of the iconic things that you associate. The cape comes from here, kind of the rat-like features that are associated with it are here as well. Also, the connection between the vampire and the Jewish people. This is the first time in which that is kind of depicted, and that is a negative thing. Horror is not always a positive thing. What is depicted as scary is not always good, and this was kind of at a time period in which there were rising fears, particularly over in Eastern Europe, where this film was set, about that, and so that is being articulated and manifested on the screen itself. That too, I think, is another underlying element of this film that makes it pretty terrifying.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen Nosferatu, but I know that the image that comes from the film, I can see it in my mind, and of course Nosferatu is now embodied in the character of Stephen Miller, who's a member of the Trump administration who thinks of evil things to do. So what about so Dracula came along in 1931, the same year that the first Frankenstein film came out.
That's right. So yeah, these are kind of your more traditional adaptations of these figures. They're kind of setting it, at least for American audiences. These are kind of where a lot of the tropes kind of came from. Particularly this early Frankenstein adaptation really took a lot of liberties with the tale, adding in kind of the first appearance of the henchman, Igor, who is not that's not from the novel in any capacity. Right. It kind of puts more emphasis on the bringing to life, and it dumbs down the creature substantially. Because as we talked about earlier, in Mary Shelley's original novel, the creature is a learned being. He starts from a place where he doesn't know anything, but he then, from watching a family, he begins to learn the language, and but that is scrapped in favor of the lumbering, towering, bolted creature that you probably think of when you hear Frankenstein.
Yeah. And, as I recall, that first Frankenstein movie was actually pretty good. And even though, of course, it's in black and white, which actually works for that particular story. So as we get into the more modern times, we had a seminal film come out in 1968. So which one was that?
Yeah, so this is the original Night of the Living Dead. Kind of essentially birthed the zombie movement. single-handedly here. Of course, as we mentioned before, zombies and the undead rising have been referenced in other literature. The Revenant is an early adaptation, those kind of creatures. But Night of the Living Dead is pretty significant here because this is coming out at a time, this is the filmmaker's reaction to the Red Scare, kind of explicitly. There was a lot of people who were worried about a mind virus infecting the population, and that it was being articulated in the Night of the Living Dead. It's kind of thought of as an anti-communist film that is using these zombies creatures as one of the things that's most terrifying to Americans at that time.
Oh my gosh, I never knew that. I do remember, seeing Night of the Living Dead and being genuinely frightened by it when I saw it. Maybe I was like 10 or 12, Now, I looked at it, my son Andy and I watched it a few years ago, and it just looks ridiculous now, but it's very slow moving, unlike, more modern horror films.
Yeah, I watched the Zack Snyder remake first, and I watched that when I was way, way too young, and that was the movie that scared the living shit out of me. I could not... The end of that film, it makes a slight adjustment to where they're kind of like, you think they're escaping, they're on this boat, only for you to realize, uh-oh, they're not getting away. And after I saw that when I was a kid, I straight up could not sleep without the lights on for like 2 or 3 nights.
Wow. That's actually Dawn of the Dead, which I think was George Romero's second film after the original Night of the Living Dead. And Zack Snyder's version of it is fantastic. It's really good. The opening credits to it, if you never watch any of that movie, just watch the opening credits, are fantastic. So, well, I've always been fascinated by zombies. In fact, I actually wrote a novel called Zombie Road Trip, which you can find on Amazon for your Kindle. And this was my idea for this one was to tell it from the zombies' point of view, which doesn't seem to make sense, but I figured out a way to do it. And I also really wanted to explore what it would actually be like to use your own teeth and hands to tear into another human being. And so it gets pretty graphic, but I thought it was an interesting way to go. But it's also, I think, pretty funny. So it's only like very low cost. Nobody's ever read it, but you could be among the first. Kindle. So what about, there's another one that I remember. This is even old for me, but Rosemary's Baby. What was that one about?
Yeah, so Rosemary's Baby, based on a novel first, fantastic book, but it was adapted in 1968, and it's about this fear that you can give birth to the Antichrist. It's revolving around this woman who realizes that something strange is going on with her pregnancy, and she gets interfered with by these really creepy medical professionals and other advisors, and you kind of slowly realize, wait a second, these people around me may not be on my side here. They may all be in cahoots with the Antichrist trying to do their ritualistic practice. So it's it's a very spooky. The film, this was by Roman Polanski, I believe, and one of his earlier works. And I don't like the film quite as much as I like the original novel, but I know that the film version kind of is what sticks in the majority of viewers' minds. The novel is a little bit more subtle and preys on a whole lot more fears about... It focuses a lot more on the mother's perspective, and so you really kind of get these chilling fears about like what happens truly when a woman loses control of her body, when everybody else kind of gets to make all of these decisions for her. Those elements are kind of at play in the film, but it's really more spooky, ooh, is the devil gonna come kind of vibe.
Wow, never thought of Rosemary's Baby as a pro-choice film, but I can see that. Another one that came out then, I remember this from when I was a kid, The Exorcist came out in 1973, and holy shit, this was huge. It was huge. It was probably the biggest horror movie of, I don't know if all time, but it was just, took over the popular culture in kind of the way Jaws would do in a couple of years later. The story is pretty terrifying, but it also had this fantastic soundtrack by Tubular Bells. It was I think that was the name of the band, Tubular Bells. So what do you know about this one? Have you done this one on your podcast?
I have. We have done an episode about the Exorcist. This is not one of my favorite films, but there's no denying, like you said, that this absolutely kind of this captured the cultural imagination for sure. There were so many reports about and reporting done on the opening and how sick it was making people at the time. There was so much media chatter about people fainting. You have people having to go to the hospital because the film is just so scary. So it kind of started a little bit of that modern obsession with the horror genre. It was one of the first times it was kind of really taken seriously as a craft and not just some schlop that would be done. Even though there were great examples of horror and monster stuff before, The Exorcist really kind of represented a changing point in how it was understood culturally.
Yeah, wow. And also, you know, anything that gets the Catholics riled up is always going to drive ticket sales as well. So
that's true.
So we get into the slasher films, which I don't know if there's a lot to say about those. It's definitely scary and terrifying to think of something popping out of the dark and cutting you.
Yeah, I would agree. I kind of think that the slasher genre was really being defined in these early years by films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, of course the iconic Halloween from 1978, and then Friday the 13th in 1980s. They're all kind of riffing around similar material. It's kind of like teens kind of stuck in a situation. For my money, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the best of these. It's the earliest. Mm-hmm. It's kind of does more, I think, with the family at play who is doing the murders there. There's a lot of really interesting conversations about disability that can be had from that early film. But yes, the slasher genre is probably the genre that, at least on the film side, that is most prevalent today. If you go and you see a horror film like, I don't know, Smile 2, which is currently in theaters now, that's a slasher. It's big, it's in your face, it's body horror.
Right. And then as we get into a little bit more of the modern era, Nightmare on Elm Street, which wasn't a slasher film, it was more of a psychological terror where this guy gets into your dreams, right? I've never seen it, but my wife, who does not like horror films, saw it when she was a teenager, and it still gives her nightmares. That's how effective it was.
Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite horror film of all time. This is Wes Craven's work. Wes Craven is I think of him as kind of a god in the horror world, at least the horror filmmaking world. He also does Scream later, which I know we're going to talk about in just a second. But yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street created the iconic Freddy Krueger, who was not only this lumbering psycho figure who could like torture you, but he was also one of the first elements of the kind of wisecracking quipper, who he was not only going to rip you apart with his claws, but he was also going to verbally assault you as well.
With
so
his biting
your
sarcasm.
dignity was not spared. That's right.
Wow.
So it's a Nightmare on Elm Street. It spawned a whole bunch of sequels, and I know that the Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street sequels all kind of get lumped into the same thing of people being like, "Oh, they're all crap."
Yeah,
but that's wrong. That's not true about the Nightmare on Elm Street series. All the way up, the Dream Warrior is incredible. Number 3, the second one is an insane exploration of the gay male experience that came out the following year that just broke all barriers. And the genre really it continued. Kind of by the 5th one, it kind of starts to peter out a little bit. I'll give you that. But Nightmare franchise, one of my faves. Great. Okay. I never saw it. I'm not a big horror film guy. Like I said, I like zombies and some of that. But what about Scream? This is 1996. What's that one? So Scream is kind of thought of as the first meta horror film. So by this point, Scream comes out. It's also by Wes Craven. It's 1996, and people are just talking about how, is horror dead? There's nothing you can possibly do with this genre anymore. Everybody already knows the tropes. So this film is kind of essentially being like, what if people who already know all of the tropes of horror movies, they love horror movies, what if they get into a spooky situation with a ghost-faced killer? And so it is insanely meta, it's very funny, but also still somehow manages to be incredibly violent, because it proves that even if you know, or you think you know what's going to happen in like these horror films, that doesn't make being disemboweled any less terrifying.
All right. This next one is really in a class of its own. The Blair Witch Project came out in 1999. And so I count myself among one of the audience at the time who didn't know that it was not really found footage, which his whole thing was about. Like, holy shit, is this real? And it's really terrifying. And Toni, it just so happens that Gregg Hale, who's the producer of Blair Witch Project and who went to film school with the two guys that created it, is a friend of a friend, and we've got him on the podcast. So thanks, Gregg Hale, for coming on. So we thought it'd be really cool to touch base with you. And what we were talking about kind of specifically was what scares people. And so, I'd love to talk a little bit about the background of the film itself, but also kind of your take on, what makes things scary.
Wow, that's a very broad question.
Yeah,
I don't mean, what makes things scary? I don't know. I mean, I think the thing about fear is I think we're kind of hardwired to want to be afraid.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of our brain that is supposed to be afraid, because I think fear is very useful. Like when you're a caveman, I'm afraid of that thing, so I'm going to run away from it or avoid it or hide from it or whatever. So I think we were kind of hardwired to fear things. And I think in some people, that's a very that's kind of like for me, that's a pleasurable experience. I've always enjoyed being afraid. I enjoy that endorphin rush. Mm-hmm. So I think it's like highly personal. I mean, I think maybe that's the thing about fear, right? Is that it's highly personal. What scares some people doesn't scare others,
right? So yeah, thinking about Blair Witch specifically, some of the stuff in there that's so scary is very basic, like twigs snapping in the woods, being lost in the woods. I mean, those are really old. That goes back to grim fairy tale kind of stuff, which we talked about some as well.
Yeah, it's those core fears, and it's kind of triggering that fight or flight, that survival mode that was so important to those cavemen you just mentioned.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I think the thing about Blair was, we didn't have any money to do anything besides, step on twigs and make noises in the dark. But I think that like you're saying, like Blair kind of taps into like these really basic fears that people have been writing about or exploring creatively for a long time, and we just lucked into doing it in like at the time was kind of a new form of it, right? A new form that felt really real, and I think that kind of elevated that basic fear to, okay, now we're bringing this primal fear completely into contemporary, and I hate the word, but zeitgeist, I guess. Like what felt real at the time, which I've always said, the most probably the most influential thing on Blair Witch was Cops. Show Cops.
The television show Cops. Like the body cams and everything.
Yeah, because Cops came out. I mean, you take it for granted now, but when Cops first came out, I was fascinated by Cops because you had never seen a show like that, right? You had never seen a show that just followed somebody around, and most of the time nothing happening until it did, right? And that's what made Cops so compelling. And that's kind of what Blair Witch is, right? Like, so reality became, I can see the light. There's clearly a camera there. There's a light on the camera. They're not trying to hide the fact that there's a camera there. You just follow somebody around. Nothing happens. That was what reality meant. And that's kind of what Blair Witch was, right? So it kind of felt like what reality, the current interpretation of reality at the time.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I would never have thought of the show like Cops being such a significant influence on Blair Witch, because very different kind of mediums and subject matters. But I definitely see that connection, and like just the ability, the primal power of, as an audience member, being able to see everything in real time as kind of it's unfolding. It's really captivating.
Yeah, and we were also talking about comparing it to like War of the Worlds, because there's a hoax aspect to it also.
Yes.
So if you're like me and I saw it fresh in the theaters and everybody didn't know that it was a hoax, and there was a whole lot of don't tell, kind of thing. Don't
Right,
give it
right,
away, kind of thing. So I want to back up just a little bit and ask about so this was written and directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, and so you were one of the producers. How did you get involved in the film?
We all went to film school together. There were like five of us, like five of us. The core group that really made the films kind of soup to nuts was five of us, and we all went to the University of Central Florida together. So I knew Dan and Ed from film school, and Ed and I are still in business together after 28 years.
Right. And then how did you get okay, Gregg, you're a producer. How did you get that role?
I mean, we were all out of film school. We were doing what probably most film students do, which is like struggling with what the hell are we gonna do? Everybody wants to make a movie, and what the hell movie are we gonna make, and how will we get money for it? And just Dan and I were in Florida. I had come back to Florida from LA after kind of like saying I wanted to make movies instead of work on other people's movies. And we were just sitting around one night, like talking about projects. And Dan kind of offhanded was like, Ed and I came up with this idea when we were in school at UCF about these kids. They're like, kind of like, it's like an In Search Of episode a little bit. And they're investigating this witch, and they go into the woods, and then, they find these things hanging from a tree, and then they end up in a house, and then they're never seen again. And we kind of investigate it like In Search Of. And I immediately, really, the hackles on the back of my neck stood up just from that's really simple pitch. And right away I was like, that's what we're doing. And never produced anything before, except to the extent that everybody produces their own stuff in film school.
Right.
Because I knew Dan and Ed would write and direct it, and I just said, I'll do whatever I got to do, and that was produce. So I just produced it.
And I'm kind of curious. There's so much kind of urban legend around the filmmaking process of this at this point. I just want to ask you, kind of from your perspective, how much of it was kind of improvised and how much of it was kind of written down? I know there was quite a few hours of footage that were shot, edited down to about 82 minutes, but how much of that kind of was planned when you guys went into the woods to shoot, and how much of it was kind of just seeing what was scary to you guys in the moment?
All the beats, the beats and the actual scenes were all thought out in advance, right? So we had a very detailed outline, but it was just an outline of what happened, right? Mm-hmm. And that was really just for us, because the way we did it was we kind of made a story-based obstacle course for the actors and put them in the woods with the film camera and the video camera and moved them around with GPSs, and they didn't know what was going to happen from one moment to the next. So their reactions to everything were completely real and completely improvised, but what they were seeing and in what order, and then how their characters were supposed to react to it, that was all stuff that we laid out in our outline. So very detailed outline from a story perspective, but completely improvised from the actor's perspective.
Whoa, that's really fascinating. I can imagine how that kind of then triggers really primal reactions from your actors. If they kind of know something may go jump out at them in the woods, but they don't know when, they don't know where, they don't know how.
Yeah. And it was 24/7. Like, they literally, were in the woods camping out. We fed them less and less as we went along. This was all based on, I went through survival school in the Army. I just so happened to be wearing a military looking thing. I'm really not a military freak, but I went through survival school in the Army, which is a quite intense experience. So we were basically just kind of doing actor survival school to make the movie.
So, Gregg, after you had the film kind of ready to go, and of course it kind of made a splash at Sundance, and there's a whole story behind its trajectory from being this kind of low budget indie film to being kind of a big hit that everybody had heard of. But was there a decision at some point? It's like, okay, we're gonna not tell anybody that this is real, or was that just baked in from the start?
Yeah, we kind of from the from the very beginning, our idea was, that it was supposed to be like In Search Of, that old show with Leonard Nimoy, which me and Ed and Dan all like completely obsessed with when we were kids. So we were kind of approaching it like In Search Of, right, where it was presented as real, which is so from the very beginning, we always, not really as a prank necessarily, but just as like our suspension of disbelief was built on the structure of something feeling like a documentary. So when we were trying to raise money to make the movie, which we never actually did at the beginning, we had a fake investor reel that was like as if it had really happened. Like the kids really had disappeared and they really had found the footage, and the parents of the kids had hired us to edit it together and figure out what had happened. And it fooled all the investors, and then they wouldn't give us any money. From the very beginning, our whole thing was building up this really elaborate world around the story and just kind of sticking to that story as reality. If you looked at our website, we had a section that had us in there as filmmakers. We always thought it was pretty clear that it was a fictional film. But people wanted to believe that it was true, so it was not very difficult to fool people. I guess.
Suckered me.
So it's since become one of the most successful independent films of all time. Did you, when you guys were making this, did you ever anticipate that it would be so big and spawn a whole franchise?
No. I mean, all of us have always said we were surprised at everything. We were surprised that we finished it, we even got it made, surprised that we get into Sundance, surprised that we sell it, surprised that we get into Cannes, surprised that we won an award at Cannes, which was crazy. And then once the film opened and started doing all the business that it did, it was just, no, never in a million years did we were hoping maybe we're lucky enough to finish it and lucky enough to sell it to HBO or something for enough money to make another movie. That was our goal. So no, not in a million years.
So Blair Witch, spawned a lot of things: comic books, games. Another, I think, a sequel or two, and there was a doc, I think, about 10 years ago that you were in about, about the whole process of the film. Are you done with Blair Witch, or are you still working on things related to this property, or what?
I mean, we would, Lionsgate, which bought Artisan, owns it lock, stock, and barrel. We have nothing to say about what is done with it. And they're continuing to explore stuff. They've announced that maybe Jason Blum from Blumhouse and James Wan are maybe going to do a pass on it. I mean, we'd love to do it, but we've pitched them a couple of ideas that they've never bitten on. So
you never know where the Blair Witch could go from here.
Yeah, but we're all still, I'm still, it's 25-year anniversary is this year, and we're all still utterly thrilled that anybody cares at all about this little movie that we made. So
right. When Toni and I were talking about this the other day, I said, well, it seemed like Blair Witch kind of broke this subgenre of found footage. And nobody else could do something quite like this, but that's not true. So there's been other films that have used this technique, like, I don't know, Toni, what were some, like Paranormal Activity, Cloverfield? Are there others that have used this technique?
Those are you've named the two big franchises that are playing in that medium.
So there's always a new generation of people that maybe haven't seen something like Blair Witch that can still be surprised by it, I guess.
Yeah, it's been kind of fun. Like, now that we're thoroughly into a new generation of people watching it, one of my favorite things about being involved with Blair is here, everybody's got a story about when they saw it. And now we're starting to get second generation stories of people who are showing it to their kids. And it still apparently works for kids, which is that's very exciting for me that it can work on a younger generation.
Yeah, totally. I watched this with my dad when I was younger. He showed it to me. He had seen it in the original in the cinema, and then we watched it at home. And I gotta say, scared the shit out of me when I was like 10 years old. I probably was too young to have watched it.
Probably.
So, Gregg, are there anything planned for the 25th anniversary, re-release or anything like that?
The thing I think that we're most excited about is there's a British company called Second Sight, and they're doing a really nice like box set re-release with a completely new transfer of the movie. We retransferred all the original film and all the original high 8, and they went in and like redid the edit with the new footage. So same movie, but completely new transfer. And there's a really great documentary on there. That's probably the thing that we're most excited about. There's been a bunch of screenings. Like I know there's a screening at the New Art, which is one of the places that first played Blair Witch back in the day in LA. They're doing a screening. There's been a bunch of 25th anniversary screenings. But the re-release that we're excited about is the Second Sight one. Unfortunately, it's region, it's European region, so you'd have to get an all regions player to play it. That's going to be really care about the movie. It's probably the best looking version of the movie that you'll see because we shot it on video and film, edited it digitally, transferred that to what at the time was the best format, which was Beta SP, which is a standard def format, transferred that to film for Sundance, and then transferred that film to video for the DVD. So it gets pretty murky after a while.
Well, that kind of works in some ways, right?
That's true. That is a very good point. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Toni, did you have anything else?
That's it for me. Thank you so much, Gregg, for taking the time to hop on, and congratulations on 25 years of Blair Witch.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks again, Gregg. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you, guys.
The last one in this sort of modern horror is Saw in 2004, another thing I haven't seen, but I'm sure you know all about.
Yeah, Saw is definitely kind of building on the slasher genre that had come before it was really kind of starting to find itself in the mid-70s and early 80s, but Saw kind of steps it up to a whole nother level. It's just basically asking you, like, what happens if you're trapped and forced to torture either yourself or somebody else who you're in the room to get out of this situation. Also, Jigsaw that puppet is a pretty iconic horror figure now, too.
Okay. And then more recently, like Get Out was a great one. That was kind of more of a social horror thing. Any others like in real recent years that stand out?
Get Out is absolutely kind of changed the game, at least in terms of how modern audiences were able to think about horror. It kind of tapped into the modern social horror / trauma horror that we are seeing all over today. So Hereditary is a great example of kind of that familial trauma being really tapped into. Midsommar is a great example of kind of the religious kind of groups and the trauma that is found there, as well as familial trauma as well. That's another. Midsommar is one of my favorites, but you see this in a lot of horror, particularly stuff that's coming out from A24 in particular. It's just horror as kind of horror in addition to what social fear, what kind of social, what movement are you kind of also building into? And that's kind of where the horror genre is at today. It's kind of, you either have these kind of cheap slashery type films like The Smiles or The Strangers that are coming out, and then you have the more elevated stuff like The Substance that just came out this year, which is a fascinating horror film kind of about our culture's obsession with beauty standards and the double standards that we have for women. So yeah, that's where we're at least horror-wise through the years. It's fascinating genre, one of my faves, and there's always something cool coming out.
All right. Yep. And plenty of live stuff on stage and around Colorado, in addition to all these films. And also, if you want to really do deep dives into some of these horror films, Toni, his podcast with your former professor, I believe, Such a Nightmare.
That's right.
Conversations with Horror. The latest episode I noticed was about Leprechaun 3. I was like, wow, I can't believe they made 3 of this. So you go deep.
They've made way more than 3.
Really? Okay.
We just got done recording our episode about Leprechaun in Space, and then next is Leprechaun in the Hood, which I think is going to be awful, but I'm excited to talk about.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all of our spooky stuff for now. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, our top 10 Colorado headliners and my conversation with Blaine Krauss from Hamilton. OnStage Colorado is brought to you by the Aurora Fox Arts Center, whose production of Around the World in 80 Days runs through October 27th. It's a fast-paced journey with wealthy Englishman Phileas Fogg and his valet Passepartout, who've bet they can circumnavigate the globe in just 80 days. Traveling by boat and train, they visit exotic locales and meet a wide array of quirky characters. Tickets at aurorafoxartscenter.org. OnStage Colorado also gets support from the Colorado Fine Arts Center at Colorado College, presenting The City Dog and the Prairie Dog from November 2nd through 24th. It's a bilingual musical about exploring the world, learning new things, and maybe, just maybe, coming home again. Support also comes from the Boulder Ensemble Theater Company, Betsy, featuring the world premiere of The Ballad of Paula Aguilar. Just in time for the November election comes this smart comedy about ethnic stereotypes, feckless political consultants, and one woman's journey toward personal fulfillment. At the Dairy Center in Boulder through November 3rd. All right, we're back and ready to hit this week's Colorado headliners. So these are some of the upcoming shows we think you should know about, and in no particular order. Toni, you want to kick it off?
Absolutely. So my first headliner pick, actually my first couple headliners, are going to be keeping in the spirit of spooky that we were just talking about before. So this is Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas in concert. So this is being done by the Colorado Symphony, and it's back by popular demand from last year. So they're going to be showing the full-length feature film on the big screen, accompanied by the Colorado Symphony playing Danny Elfman's iconic score
Such
live.
a great score. Oh my God.
Yeah,
even if you don't like the movie.
It's
great.
Totally,
score.
Yeah. And I've seen a couple of these kind of in-concert performances before from the Colorado Symphony, and they always do a really great job. I have not actually seen this one, but I feel like this is not one to miss, particularly if you like Danny Elfman's work, you like this film, or you just want to go hear the Colorado Symphony play some really spooky music.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So this will be at the Denver Performing Arts Complex, October 25th through the 20th.
Okay. Do you think tickets will be hard to get for that one? Or?
Tickets are still available at the moment, but I probably would not wait.
Okay. The next one, my first headliner is Cannibal the Musical, which we talked about a little bit ago. I believe tickets are very scarce for this one, so if not sold out. So I won't spend a lot of time on it because this will be at Town Hall Arts Center, October 25th to November 3rd. It is the tale of Colorado's Alfred Packer, who was literally a real person who was tried for cannibalism back in the 1800s. And this is it was Trey Parker from South Park fame created this for the film was originally called Alfred Packer the Musical. It was his project when he was a film student at the CU Boulder. And this is kind of the stage version of it. It's completely ridiculous, highly offensive, very funny show. So if you get a chance, go see it.
Stephen Burge told me that they only have single tickets available at the moment. Best availability is Halloween, or you can get rush tickets at the box office on there before. So that's the only way you're going to be able to see Cannibal, though, because it's so freaking popular.
Yeah, great.
My next pick is Mind Game by Wheat Ridge Theater Company, and this is a psychological thriller play that is set in a mental hospital. And so it involves the writer of true crime tales who is going to an experimental hospital for the criminally insane, who wants to interview a serial killer for his next book. However, when he gets there, things do not seem quite right. So this 3-person play is kind of a thriller in the truest sense, and it's going to be running at Wheat Ridge from October 25th through November 10th.
Okay, cool. This is a lighter thing here. Monopoly Life-Size Travel Edition. So this is a Denver Center off-center production, one that they've brought in. And this is just like it sounds. It's a giant game of Monopoly that you play, and I don't know much more about it, but it'll be at Broadway Park, Denver, which is, I think, is this their new kind of somewhat permanent location for off-center productions?
That's right. Yeah, they're going to be there for the next 2 years. It was formerly an Ace Hardware store, a beauty place, and another retail shop. They've had to convert it to get it ready for this production. But yeah, off-center is going to be there for the next 2 years.
Okay. So this show, you got show or experience has got plenty of time to see it. It starts October 22nd. today. So, and runs all the way through January 5th. So plenty of time.
My next headliner is a Twilight Zone parody, Serling Centennial. So this is being done by the theater company of Lafayette, and this is another installment of their ever-popular Twilight Zone parodies. And this one is honoring the 100th birthday of Twilight Zone creator Rod Serling. So it's going to be an evening that features 3 episodes that are inspired by the Twilight Zone and 3 commercials that are parodies, all in honor of the show's creator. So this will be in Lafayette from October 25th through November 10th.
All right. The next one I want to mention is Nonsense. A little bit of a warhorse musical comedy. It's been around for a while, but Parker Arts is doing it. And this is not at the Pace Center. It'll be at the smaller venue, the Schoolhouse, which is a really nice smaller venue. It's not that small. Great space, October 25th through November 7th. And I'm not sure who is producing this. It just says, do you know?
It's going to be, it's produced by Veritas Production, who did A School of Rock at Parker Arts earlier this year.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So this is, I think, their second big show, because they're a fairly new production company. So Nonsense, Parker Arts, October 25th through November 7th.
The next headliner that I've got is by a new theater company, Unleashed Theater, and they are producing the 2-person comedy Matt and Ben, about Ben Affleck and Matt Damon working together to write Good Will Hunting. So it's these 20-something folks who are chilling in their Boston apartments while they're trying to write that iconic Oscar-winning screenplay. His Unleashed Theater Company is done by these 2 women who they had formerly been working on they had been doing a comedy group in Longmont, but now they're kind of pivoting to do theater. And this is going to be a touring production that will be in multiple venues, including Town Hall Collaborative, the Three Leeches,
formerly Benchmark.
Town Hall, Town Hall Collaborative, Benchmark Theater's former space. It's going to be at the Dairy Center. And so you've got a ton of time to catch this. It'll be October 25th through November 3rd.
All right, cool. Next one I was going to mention up in Fort Collins is Hadestown. Will be at the Lincoln Center October 25th through 27th, so just this weekend. I believe this is a touring production, a professional touring production. It's a very cool musical that I loved when I saw it a couple of years ago at the Denver Center. It's based on a couple of Greek myths. I wrote in my review last time, as fun as they are to watch, many a big-ass Broadway musical can seem a bit formulaic. That couldn't be said about Hadestown, a mashup of so many disparate stories and styles as to be a constant surprise factory. So if you're up in Fort Fun, check it out.
The final thing I want to spotlight this week is Vision Box Studio Theater's conversation with David Hyde Pierce. So he is he's an actor who's been seen on screen and on stage a lot, and he's going to be having a conversation about why theater matters today. John Moore did a really excellent piece about this for the Denver Gazette, in which he got to interview David and have a little bit of a conversation, not only about his career, but a little bit of a tease about why theater matters. And David was kind of talking a little bit about how it kind of creates the space for us to have these difficult conversations as a society. And it inspired some really interesting comments on Facebook from other readers. So if you're interested in having that conversation about why theater matters today with David Hyde Pierce, it's going to be at the Meisel Center in Denver, October 26th, 4 p.m.
All right. Cool. Yeah, I was trying to, they had reached out to me and I was trying to get David on the podcast, but it didn't work out for whatever reason. So definitely check out John's story in the Gazette. It kind of goes through the whole thing. All right. Well, my last headliner is Ghostlight. So this is at Thunder River Theater Company in Carbondale, October 25th through 31st. So this is cool. It's an evening of immersive ghost stories, all from Colorado playwright Michael Duran and based on experiences he's had in theaters in Colorado, including at the Bonfils Memorial Theater, Loretta Heights College, and the Steamboat Depot Arts Center. So that's going on at Thunder River. All right, so that's our headliners. Also, new and upcoming reviews on the site, including Crowns, Kinks, and Curls from Family, Devil's Crutch, Frankenstein from Audacious, the Ballet of Paula Aguilar, The Squirrels at Westcliff Community Players, and $1 Million Quartet at Lone Tree I just posted this morning. Evergreen Players Spirit Level, which I'll rate here in a little bit. Murders at Vintage Theater Plus. Make Pretend at Rise Comedy and updating at Comedy Works from our new correspondent, Kevin Douglas.
All right, so go check out all those reviews, plus the latest theater news from around the state at OnStage Colorado. But first, we're going to hear Alex's interview with Blaine Krauss now, so hang on.
All right, we are here with Blaine Krauss, who is playing Alexander Hamilton in Hamilton, now up at the Denver Center. Hi, Blaine. Thanks for being on the OnStage Colorado podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I saw the show last night. I thought you were great. It was an amazing cast, great show, really great reception from the audience. How did that one
Yes,
feel?
last night was thrilling. It was good. It was really good.
Yeah. So, you were the understudy to Hamilton and Burr for, a chunk of, I guess, the last tour. And now you've stepped into the lead role. And so how does that feel to kind of be up there in the front instead of waiting in the wings?
It is, it's exciting, just being in any capacity and in the we call it the Hamilton universe, is, cause she's grown, she's so big now, and there's a lot of players and characters. Being any piece of this universe is, it's thrilling. It's an honor. It's getting to perform at the highest level of art in your career. There just isn't material like Hamilton, as we know. This kind of stuff comes once in a decade, a generation. I was really lucky to be a standby when I first joined the tour, the same tour, the Philip Company that's playing in Denver right now. I joined them about a couple months before the pandemic.
Wow.
And that was at the time that I did that. I've done a couple Broadway shows and did a lot of singing and some TV stuff, and I had always been a cover to the lead. But when I joined as a standby, I joined as a principal standby. So I wasn't in the show. I was off stage only waiting to play the principal. So it was actually a very new leveled up position for me.
Yeah.
And a really cool opportunity as an actor in a piece to get to see the show as much as I did, because I didn't, wasn't in it every night, and to play so many different important roles and to really, understand these characters in a way that most people don't when you just get to play one. So now getting to be the guy 8 shows a week, 2 hours and 45 minutes on stage with 2 breaks.
Yeah. Wow.
It's all those things times 20, right? Just as thrilling, wonderfully exhausting, and an honor. And just, for me, at my age and what I'm doing in my career, to get to play this role, at this level for amazing cities like Denver is just like something I think maybe every day that I kind of stop and go, wow, look around.
Right.
How lucky we are to be alive right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like you have such a great actor's resume. I mean, you were on Broadway and Natasha Pierre in The Great Comet of 1812. You traveled the world as Simba in The Lion King. You're a presidential scholar in 2010. You met Obama and performed at the Lincoln Center and all kinds of, the Kennedy Center, all kinds of great stuff. So you alluded to this a second ago. What's it like to play against a character like Burr that you know so well that you've also played? Do you sometimes think, oh man, I would have done it the other way, or he found something I didn't, things like that? Right.
Yeah. Definitely, they find something different all the time. That's what's really cool about doing theater, right? Nightly, it's a whole different experience. I think what's so unique about Hamilton and this story is, there's no one true hero or villain. Right. I think you can split those characteristics up between Hamilton and Burr. So I found when I was playing Burr full time, and now that I'm playing Hamilton full time, and I also discovered this as a standby, but to me, the 2 men, I saw them as really the same guy. They literally have a very similar physical story, both orphans, both sent, to school to work and become better. They both want to rise up. They both want to deliver and promise and leave a legacy. And for me, the main difference between the two of them is how they go about achieving that. Right. Hamilton says this is a world where you have to take and go and be bold and just go for it. And Burr says this is a world where you have to be, patient and methodical and strategical. But I find more and more that I do the show that we are the same person. We are the same. It's funny. I'll be even honest with you too. When I started doing Hamilton, even as a standby, I at first couldn't see Burr as this friend that everyone says he is. At the very end of the show, when they're doing the duel and Hamilton's doing his last monologue, he looks at Burr, he goes, "Burr, my first friend, my enemy." And it took me a minute on page and in rehearsal to be like, how is this guy his friend? He's so not, from the get-go. The moment Hamilton asks him a question, he goes, be quiet. Don't show yourself. So, but then I started to realize again, like these two guys, they want the same thing. So Hamilton sees that in Burr. Burr sees that in Hamilton, which is why they inch towards each other, even though they both know the energy is a little different than what I would normally go for. So it's really cool getting to have had that vantage point and to get to play that because, like you said, I know those soft spots for the Burr, the character. So as an actor, I know where I can really poke and let the other actor really get irked because I've done it. So I know I'm like, oh, that this will set him off if I edge him that way, But our Burrs are fantastic. The Burr who normally is in the show is amazing. And you saw Alex Nicholson last night, who's a dream. He's actually the position I was when I joined the show as a standby. Okay. And so it's really cool to get to do different takes and, different vibes on the.
Yeah, he was fantastic. I didn't realize he was an understudy either. So, but yeah, they do have that. There is that jealousy factor, kind of like a Mozart Salieri kind of thing, where Burr doesn't rise to the same level he does, and it's hard. But you can see the whole frenemy thing going. It's really interesting to think of them as two sides of the same coin.
They're the same coin.
So a less profound question, I can't help but think, looking at, when I see people on stage in really heavy costume, and that's a really lively show with a lot of dancing. Do they design those? I mean, imagine they've got to be a lot lighter than they were back in, the 18th century, right. But how is it in the coat and all that? Does it take a while to get used to?
I'm so happy you asked this question, Alex. I've been joking around. I was like, I want to do, those TikTok trends of you wearing your different outfits during the day. And I was like, I want to do one of those trends just so people can see how many layers we are wearing under. It's so hot. It's so hot. And they're light, but they're made like that brown leather coat I have at the top. It's brown leather.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And those wool jackets, they're wool. And I joke, but the undergarments are serious. Like we wear the regular underwear, the tights that they would wear back then, the socks over the tights, the shirts under the shirts and the ruffles and then the vest. So, and we're pretending it's summer outside, right. So, it's a sweaty job, but my first show I did Great Comet, and that was set in Russia. And during the winter. And so we also were wearing wool coats for 3 hours running around the stage. So, I get used to it. And right. I think, I used to be somewhat serious. I used to be a little self-conscious kind of it. Like, God, I sweat a lot personally. My God, they're just seeing me. But then as I got older, the more I do my craft, the more I realize what makes theater special. That's one of the things that makes it so special is you sit there and you see the work being done by the audience member. You know what I mean? And even though you're invested in the story, that extra layer of seeing someone who is your peer, right? You're an audience member. You don't know these cast members, but they live in the same world you live in. Seeing your peer get on stage and work and become like a superhero to deliver this story, I think in a way it elevates the audience. You know what I mean? The journey. They're not sweating, but they've gone on that very same journey that the sweat produced. I think it kind of amplifies it.
Yeah,
but put it simply, it's hot.
Yeah, you have to wonder, why do those people back then put themselves through that? They didn't have laundry machines.
Exactly.
No dry cleaner. So I wanted to ask you, do you have, of course, there are so many great moments in this show, but do you have a particular one where you're just like, it's coming up and you're just getting really excited. That's going to go? Oh. Is there one of those moments for you?
There's two. The obvious one would be my shot, I guess, right. Obvious. There's just, you're a theater guy, the I Want song in a piece of theater, that starts to show off that, lets you know what we're going to do for 3 hours, right? The character says, this is what I want in life right. or this moment. And that number is crafted so perfectly, Alex, like so perfectly. it just hits all the right levers of what you want and a number that's going to get the audience excited to go on a 3-hour journey. And what I especially like about it is that it's incredibly dense and nuanced. And, it's so layered. It starts off showing, this physically nervous, kind of half swaggy guy getting into his confidence. And then you get to see his skills and being able to build a coalition and inspire people. And then you have fun, playful, energetic moments. You see his humor, and then it flips very quickly, and you get a moment where you get deep and you hear about, what he thinks about at night and the death thing that's always on his mind. And then you get the political stump speech, and you get all these different colors and layers that you don't usually get in one number. The second secret one is probably second act, and it's when Jefferson and Burr and Madison confront Hamilton about his affair.
Right.
And the song's called We Know. And Hamilton delivers this really quick rap where he basically explains that they have got it all wrong. And he explains what happened. And then he explains, how he kept all the money and just basically how their fault. And it's one of the fastest, quickest, wordiest, and I get excited because I get nervous. I'm like, okay, I hope I deliver this moment. But while I'm doing it and when it's done, it's actually such a good high. It's such a rush, getting to have been confronted like that, and then to just turn around and smack them with wit and intelligence and the fastness of Hamilton's brain and tongue. And then, of course, right after that is Hurricane, and he gets to, get set up for another deep, intimate moment. So the first one for the dramaturgy, the second one for the fear of getting it right. And then when I get it right, I'm like, I made this mountain.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, another moment I wanted to ask you about, and this is something I always ask actors when I interview them, is every actor has that one moment. They might have been 5 years old. They might have been in college or whatever. Was there one moment where you're like, okay, this is what I have to do? Can you identify?
This is it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I have an interesting path into doing theater and musical theater. I started off as a singer first growing up. Always knew I wanted to be a vocalist, went to performing arts schools like that as a kid. When I was at the peak of my dreaming, I could have been Usher or Bryant McKnight. There might be a very different age group on your podcast listeners going to have to Google who Bryant McKnight is, but very, very popular soul singer. And I also am a nerd and love education. So maybe there's a quality I share with Lynn and Hamilton. And so when I was prepping to go to school, I was on a track to be more of a choir vocal major because I was a singer, but I did not want to do classical music. I really was dreaming to be a more contemporary pop singer. So of course I got into doing musicals, middle school, high school. And a key big moment was when I first heard musicals that came from or were about my community. I'm African American, biracial. So when I heard Dreamgirls for the first time, and when I heard Jelly's Last Jam for the first time, and then when I heard the contemporary shows In the Heights, I was like, oh, this sounds like the very same music that I would like to sing for the radio, but this is happening on stage. So I got pulled in and sucked in even more. And then really honestly, very simply, I was doing a national program for your listeners. It's called Young Arts. And if you're 17 or below, you should Google that. It's an amazing national arts program. You fly down and it's every discipline and you work with artists and teachers and Broadway stars. And it's not just theater, it's art, poetry, film, writing, dance, flute, organ players can come down and get there doing this. Long story short, I entered that program, entered it as just a regular vocalist and as a theater person. And they said, hey, you got into both, but you're going to have to choose one. And we suggest you do the one that if you go to school, you'll be able to benefit from scholarships, grants that the program offers. And so very quick split decision. I was like, well, I don't want to go to school for choir. That's not my jazz. This theater thing has been fun. I guess I'm good at it. I keep getting cast in shows and I really love this music. I know that theater is a niche art form. It's a specific art form. I won't say it's privileged, but it's an expensive art form to go see at a high level. So it attracts a very specific audience. So what I really loved was that it felt like I was crossing genres, crossing communities, bringing my family over into an art form that they hadn't even been at, but with like a little hook of sounds, that they're familiar with. And from then on, I've been doing musical theater. I went to CCM College Conservatory of Music for it, and it's I don't want to say it's a tough business, but you've got to really go at it and focus. So I put my blinders on and have been doing it, and I've been nonstop. And of course, I have moments. The first time I ever saw Brian Stokes Mitchell open his mouth, I was like, oh, that's who I need to be. I need to be like that. When I saw Billy Porter for the first time, I was like, okay, I also need to be like that. So those are two idols. But yeah, there wasn't a switch. There was more this kind of reconciling with the dreams and kind of an inner thing of like, okay, this is what I've always wanted, but this thing is pulling me. How can I make these two things work? And then we just hit the ground running.
All right. Well, that's a great story, great origin
Thank
story
you.
there. Hey, I wanted to switch gears back to Hamilton and talk about, have you, since you've been doing this show, you become more interested in this chapter of American history since becoming part of the show? And like, what's your understanding of Hamilton and the passion that drove him so hard?
Yeah, what's so interesting about the story and the reason why Lin-Manuel, who wrote it, he picked up this book, I think at the airport, that Ron Chernow wrote. And he was reading it on the beach, and he was reading it while he was on vacation of doing his first Broadway show in the Heights, just for fun. Mm-hmm. And he read the very beginning of Hamilton's story, the part about him being from the Caribbean and him immigrating to the Americas, but him being seen as someone different from this land. Even though he was a fellow white guy, as most people were back in that time, because he was not from Europe, he was not seen like a normal white European guy. In modern day times, he was seen as the immigrant, the other. And so that immediately caught Lynn's eye. And I think that's the big crux of who he is and what ignited his passion. Very obviously, the loss of family, didn't know his father, mother killed, after the hurricane, went to live with a cousin commits suicide. So he's got obviously that thing early on where when you're parentless and familyless, you don't or do decide that you're going to have to make a path on your own. So he's got that willpower and strength on top of coming to a country where everyone's looking at you like, why are you here? What are you doing here? And him saying, well, I think I have something to offer. And that need and want to, leave that. And if I had to be actory about it, I would say, I think, when you lose so many people that early and you are confronted with life and death so early, at an age that you don't really start thinking about those kinds of things, you really then become hyper-focused on, well, what is the point of it all? And he became hyper-focused on, the clock is ticking and I don't know when it will have its final tick. So I need to get these things out and build this legacy so that I'm still here. What did my father leave? What did my mom leave? Except for me, So I think that's kind of like that core little, why is he so crazy? Why is he so passionate? Why won't he shut up? Why is he obsessed?
Yeah. Well, it turned out to be kind of prescient on his part. He didn't live a particularly long life because of Aaron
right,
Burr.
Exactly, right.
So Hamilton started in 2015, so it's actually coming up on its 10th anniversary. It's hard to believe. It seems like in the show, but what do you think makes it attribute to its continued popularity?
I always say that there is something for everyone in this room, that theater space that, we find ourselves in at 8:00 or 7:30 or 2 p.m. on matinees. Mm-hmm. And that's rare for musicals. Going back to what we were saying earlier, musicals are such a niche specific art form and draws a very specific type of crowd, and usually a crowd that harkens back to very classical musical theater and theater structure. With Hamilton, they completely blew all of that out of the water and found a way to have a room where you can have history buffs, people who are nerds about history, Find a room for people who love musical theater, who just love theater, period. A room for people who have never seen musical theater, but maybe love hip hop culture, rap culture, love rap, love jazz, love alternate sounds that you don't hear every day on theater. A room where you can bring your kids who probably don't really understand the affair, don't really understand Reynolds' pamphlet and the discussion of whether or not we should help France, you know what I mean, in their own war. But they see this excitement and this passion and joy for life, and they see color, and they see those three women come out, the Schuyler sisters, and they see a strong sister, and they just get this very basic impression of like, wow, life is awesome. Life can be beautiful. You know, little kids come and see the Sons of Liberty dressed up, and it's very cosplay, very anime in that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where else, what other piece could you get those types of people who maybe are not even interested in the other thing? You know what I mean? In the one space. Yeah. It's like kind of really amazing when you think about it. And I always, for me, artistically, also going back to my origins, when I do projects, when I'm working on my own pieces, I'm always thinking about my family, which is a very cultured, excited family, but who does not come from theater, who does not come from this world. So I'm always thinking about, okay, how can I bridge the gap, or what can I do in this that will get them excited or leave them, you know, wanting to see more. And I think Hamilton does that, you know, across the board for everybody.
Right. Yeah. I was looking around at the audience last night, and there were little kids, and, you know, there was really
everybody.
All kinds of people there. So you're doing 8 shows a week, which is a pretty heavy schedule, but you do get some downtime. So you're going to be in Denver for over a month here. So do you have any plans on what you want to do or here in Colorado?
Looking for recommendations. Obviously, I'm going to do some hikes. Would love to visit some springs. I was here in Denver 2015 for 4 days with the Lion King. Lion King was my first show. Right. I'd actually left the show. It was in New York for 6 weeks. I think the Simba at the time, I think he like twisted his ankle or something. So they were like, could you fly out tomorrow and do the show tomorrow night? So I flew out, got on a plane, landed in Denver in the afternoon, went into rehearsals, threw up because of the altitude and me jumping right into the show. And so last time I was here, I only saw Denver from walking home into the theater. So I'm looking forward to this, and I have lots of friends from Colorado in the area. So I'm looking forward. So I will take all the recommendations. I love to eat. I love an activity. You know, what do you think? What are some on the top of the list for you?
Well, I'd start by walking across the street there and seeing I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, which is playing the Denver Center Theater Company, which is a fantastic show that is playing for a few more weeks, I think. So that'd be an easy one. If you haven't been in Meow Wolf is something people always like to go check out when they're in Denver. If you haven't been to any of the Meow Wolves yet, it's really fun.
I did see that gigantic blue bear, which I'm obsessed with downtown.
Yeah, you can't do much with it. You just kind of look at it, but it is definitely a cool icon. And it's along with Lucifer, the blue horse out by the airport.
The blue horse, Lucifer.
Yeah. So, but yeah, if you've got friends around here, I'm sure there's so much going on in Denver. And, you know, there's really great, you know, also if you get over to the Arvada Center, which is kind of the next biggest theater around there, doing a production of Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy, really, Kate Hamill's play, which is really good. It's really, really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much happening. I think we had, I don't know if you're familiar with the artist Andre 3000. He's from Outkast, but he had a concert, you know, he was just chilling in the green room with us. And we're like, lots happening in Denver. Lots happening.
Yeah. And also I would say just look on our website, OnStage Colorado. We've got a calendar of all the stuff, all the theater.
You got the goods? On. Okay, perfect.
Maybe you're wanting to do more outside stuff since you're in the theater all the time.
You got to send me some food though, Alex. I'll see some theater, but where do I eat?
Oh, man. You know, I live down south of Denver, so I'm not as much of a knowledgeable about as much of those restaurants. So you probably
listen. I'll travel for good food. Don't mistake it.
I live in the suburbs. There's no good food down here. It's like
so you're having me over for dinner. Done.
Yeah, you're welcome. So cool. Well, I appreciate you giving us the time to speak about Hamilton. It's such an exciting show, and congrats on where you've gotten in your career. It's just kind of a pinnacle for you. It's got to feel great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sure you've seen the show a plethora of times. And that is, I commend you on that 3-hour journey every time.
Yeah. At
We
least
appreciate
3, I
it.
think. Yeah. Well,
Yes,
break legs
yeah.
all around for the rest of the run. And thanks again. Enjoy your time
Thanks,
in Colorado.
Alex. Have a good one.
All right, we're back. Thanks so much to Blaine Krauss for taking the time. He's doing 8 shows a week, so very busy guy who's also needing to rest in between all those performances, but it was really a fun conversation with him. So really cool. So next week we will have a conversation with the interview that you're doing with Ren Manley of the aforementioned Audacious Theater. So this is immersive, but what are you talking to Ren about?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking a little bit about the vision for Audacious, how she kind of fell into immersive creation, and then specifically we're going to talk about the financing of the immersive world. How does a small for-profit company make this work at all? We're going to dive into that, particularly given the smaller show size, the limitations when it comes to ticketing, and still wanting to produce a high-quality show in which everybody gets paid.
Okay, cool. All right, well, stick around. Come back next week for that one. If you need to contact us for any reason, just email us at info@onstagecolorado.com. Leave a comment on our socials. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much for listening. I'm Alex Miller.
And I'm Toni Tresca, and we'll see you at the show.
Mm-hmm.